Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi guys, I just read your article, INTP versus INTJ, 5 ways to truly tell them apart. And I beg you to do INTP versus INFP. Carla.
So we just started recording and I whispered, I love it when they beg. But I whispered it even more than that. And Joel said it sounded really creepy.
You just can't whisper something like that.
Yeah.
Especially the way you whispered it. It was
super creepy.
I go back and restart the whole thing.
We can't say that. Can we say that? We're going to say that. All right, INTPs and INFPs. Let's talk about the actual question. So what are some of the major markers between the two types, and why do they even look similar? I guess the first question is, why does anybody get these two types mixed up for each other? Because they actually are very different types. And yet we find a lot of people, I would say in particular, I know you said before the podcast when we were talking about this, you said you thought more men who were INFPs were going to test out as INTPs. I've actually seen it the opposite. I've seen more women who are INFPs test out as INTPs. And you and I both have sort of a theory about why you think men who are INFPs test out as INTPs.
Yeah.
And I have a theory about why women who are INFPs test out as INTPs. And I don't really see it happening the opposite as much.
No, I don't think INTPs are pretty comfortable being INTPs if they type out that way.
Yeah, they're not usually confused about whether or not they're INFPs. I'm sure it happens. There's probably a really artistic INTP out there who maybe thinks they're an INFP. It probably happens sometimes, but I think it happens the other direction a lot more.
So I'll give my theory for men, and then you can give your theory for women. How's that sound?
Okay, and then we should talk about, I think, what the similarities are before we launch into what the major differences are.
Sure. So I think for men, if you are, you take a personality test or you find out that you're an INFP, or you start to go down the road of understanding your personality type, as a man, I think there's a lot of insecurity around being typed as a feeler. I think a lot of men are really resistant to this idea. We think of being a feeler as very effeminate sometimes. And we think of it in terms of, as men, that if we're a feeler, that means we're soft or we're not masculine or we don't show up, present and masculine in certain ways. And so I think we, as men, distance ourselves from this notion of being a feeler in general. And I think it comes from social construction. I think being a feeler as a man is demonized when you're growing up as a boy. Sometimes you're made fun of if you have a feeling nature, and toughen up, don't cry. Real men don't cry. This kind of nature. So I think that's one of the reasons why guys tend to shy away from ever being identified as a feeler in like a Myers-Briggs system, for example.
You tested out as a thinker the very first Myers-Briggs test you ever took, right?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah, you tested out as an ENTP.
I did. Yeah. And I think that's because I answered the questions on the test in this is years ago, a much younger self, but I was answering a lot of the questions, in a thinking fashion, and it just skewed the results to be typed out as a thinker.
Mm-hmm. So I think women, on the other side, you would think that women would be a lot more open to being feelers. So you would believe, or it would make sense that women would be more, they would embrace this idea of being feelers more, and they would, rest into an INFP personality type description. That said, there have been studies done to do demographic breakdowns of type amongst, men, among women. What is the percentages represented? And in those breakdowns of which types are represented amongst the demographic of women, there are 4 personality types that use the cognitive function extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. They are the 4 FJ types, so ESFJs, ISFJs, ENFJs, and INFJs. And they make up nearly 50% of women. So that's like 1 in 2. 1 in 2 women is an FJ, is using extroverted feeling. So I think when we get this idea of what feeling means, especially as women, we have unconsciously imprinted or mapped ourselves to extroverted feeling being the feeling process. We always think of extroverted feeling or like emotive or huggy or interactive. Now, obviously not all FJs or harmony users are super huggy, But there is definitely the sense of being a lot more comfortable around emotions, especially other people's emotions, and as long as they're not assaulting you, like with an INFJ. But there's like the sense of like just more of like a social awareness and more of a, just more harmony.
You don't mean that INFJs are assaulting. You mean that if you're an INFJ, you don't want to feel assaulted by emotion.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that was clear.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I wouldn't have even thought that that's how my words were coming out. So we have, I think, as women, imprinted this idea of feeling unconsciously as extroverted feeling. And INFPs don't use extroverted feeling. They lead with introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, which is a very different process. And introverted feeling doesn't feel as emotive. It doesn't feel as, sort of that huggy social, like all these imprints we have around the harmony process. So I think women tend to think of themselves as not as feelers when they're INFPs, even though they're leading with a feeling process. Like their driver process is introverted feeling or authenticity. Even though they're leading with a feeling process, it is not the feeling process that we have unconsciously imprinted as a society. And so they have a tendency to think that they're thinkers. So I think this happens for both genders for different reasons, obviously, but it happens for both genders. And like we mentioned, I'm sure there's an INTP out there that mistook themselves for an INFP one time, but I mean, I've done this for a long time. I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I just don't see the numbers of INTPs mistaking themselves for INFPs as I do the opposite direction. So we're going to mostly kind of focus on the assumption that when the types mistake themselves for each other, it is usually an INFP mistaking themselves for an INTP.
Well, and we're just going to go into some of the differences, the nuanced differences, so that, if you've typed out as one of these two types, we're going to probably either confirm or you're going to question, wait, I typed out as this, but they're describing these other mental processes that are this other type. Maybe I'm not exactly sure on that I came out right on this test or whatever. So I think as we unpack this, you'll get some more clarity around that.
If this is the first time you've heard our podcast, we are going to be entering a domain of cognitive functions in type. Now, cognitive functions are the mental processes that create the structure or the infrastructure of each type. If you're unfamiliar with them, I recommend going to our website, personalityhacker.com, and in the search engine writing cognitive function or CAR diagram, and you'll run into articles that will describe what cognitive functions are, how they work, what the CAR model is, and then that will give you some frame of reference for how these work. But we're not going to stick with just the dichotomies, INFP and INTP. We're not going to just stick with basic profile explanations of these two types. We're going to go into the mental wiring of each type. And so if that's a new concept for you, go visit our website or just do a basic Google search on cognitive functions and see what you come up with. But that's the direction we're going. So to basically articulate what are their similarities, why would anybody mistake themselves for, one of the other types if they are, or the other type if they are the other type? Okay, that's very awkwardly worded, but why would an INFP think that they were an INTP? Well, they're both introverts that are perceivers, and that means all introverts that are perceivers, all IPs, lead with a mental process. Their dominant cognitive function, or what we call their driver mental process, is going to be a subjective decision-making process. That means that they're going to be determining the value of things or evaluating the world based on introverted, internal, subjective criteria. That means that they are making all their decisions based on what feels right to them or what makes sense to them as an individual. So what ends up happening throughout life is they end up engaging with the outside world and asserting a position, right? Asserting what makes sense to them or what feels right to them, and then getting negative feedback from the outside world that goes, well, that's not how it works. And for the IP, right, the introverted perceiver, or the introvert who is a perceiver, that is really jarring for them. They go, why isn't that how that works? And the outer world, which is built on an infrastructure of extroverted judging processes, extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, or what we call effectiveness and harmony, it says, well, it doesn't really matter what you think. It matters what we all think as a collective. So when IPs get that feedback, generally what happens is it's not that they're going to shut off that subjective driver process. It's not like they're going to be able to turn it off. What ends up happening is they double down on it and they get really sensitive to feedback. And so for for all 4 of the IP types, and right now we're talking about the 2 INP types, there's a tendency to want to be right. They want to be validated for their perspective. So both INTPs and INFPs can be very stubborn. They can show up in a very stubborn way. They can both evidence or manifest as people who do not like to be told that they're wrong, or they don't like to be told what to do. They can both show up as having a bit of an attitude, very power away from attitude. Now, because they're both INPs, that means they share the same co-pilot and 10-year-old processes in the car model. So their auxiliary or co-pilot process for both types is going to be what's technically named extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. And their 10-year-old or tertiary process is going to be technically called introverted sensing, or what we call memory. And because they both have the same co-pilot and 10-year-old processes, it's going to manifest itself in some similar ways. The first way it manifests itself is that they go to the same spot, that 10-year-old position or tertiary position, when they're defensive. And that's because the 10-year-old process shares the attitude of the driver. Now, that attitude basically means whether or not something's introverted or extroverted. And since their driver process is introverted, it's either going to be introverted thinking, accuracy for an INTP, or it's going to be introverted feeling or authenticity for an INFP. When they're defensive, they're going to go to the 10-year-old position of introverted sensing or memory in order to support their position. And that means that when they're being defensive, they're going to double down on what they already know. They're going to double down on what they've already experienced, and they're going to not be particularly reasonable. They're not going to want to listen to any outside information because they're holding or clinging so tightly from their position of being right. So they both show up with a bit of stubbornness, power away from, maybe even a little anarchistic. They both show up with this sense of, if the world is too hostile to my deeply held belief, whatever that is, I'm just not going to enter the world. I'm just going to stay home, or I'm going to cloister myself up, or I'm going to hide, in the basement and, read books or play video games or whatever it is. They have a tendency to both take a hiding position when they're trying to defend themselves. And so that shows up as very similar to the 2 types.
One thing about being an INTP or an INFP, this notion of wanting to be right is also somewhat of a strength, in that there is a deep sense of resolve what supports you also can, or what can cross you can also support you. You have this deep sense of resolve. You have this sense of owning yourself as an INP in the world, where you feel like you are centered, you understand how you think or how you feel about a certain situation to the degree where you can't be swayed. So there's this sense of strength in showing up to the world this way, and that's also the positive end of this. Now, what this looks like, this kind of yin-yang back and forth, for an INTP, when they're showing up to the world, they're leading with that process called accuracy, which is, again, technically introverted thinking. It's about data points making sense. It's about rational thought, and it's about understanding the accurate way to evaluate information and criteria, to make decisions about that information and criteria. So the question an INTP is always asking is, how accurate is this piece of information? How accurate is this way of thinking? And the criteria they're looking at is the subjective thought in their own head. So this notion of how accurate is this based on what I think accuracy is can sometimes lead INTPs to show up to the world to say, these people seem stupid to me. Like, this seems so obvious that this is the accurate way to think about this. Why is this person being obtuse or stupid, or like, this is so obvious to everybody? Does not everybody see this as reality? And it's almost baffling to some degree. On the other side, for an INFP, someone who leads with a process we've nicknamed authenticity, and that's technically introverted feeling, it's about what resonates with the INFP. What feels authentic? What is the true feeling that I have in my heart? And this can show up for an INFP when they're looking at this, going, does this person have good motive? Like I know if I was in the situation, I acted this way, I don't think I'd be having good motive doing this action. So they're very concerned about motives. They're concerned about intent. They're concerned about the way people are moving through the world. So what can happen for an INTP when they're coming into the world and they encounter people that don't necessarily resonate with how they would view things is people are stupid. And for an INFP, when people don't resonate with how they view things, people might be evil in their minds. So this idea of maybe stupid or evil are some labels they can give. Again, these are some of the negative things for both types, or some of the challenges both types can have. But again, what crosses you supports you. It's that deep resolve, that ability to check in with yourself as an INTP or an INFP and say, no, I think this is the way I want to go in the world. I've checked in with myself and I feel good about this. I'm internally referenced in this way. And I think this is the best course of action based on how it makes me feel for an INFP, or how the thought is accurate for me for an INTP.
Yeah. Another thing that is similar to both types is that they can have difficulty motivating themselves if they're just not feeling motivated already. Meaning that if they're not feeling inspired, it's very difficult to get into action. Their inspiration comes from something a little different for each of them, though. For an INTP, because they're leading with the process of introverted thinking or accuracy, as Joel mentioned, it's very much about data points. It's very much about information and trying to figure life out almost like a puzzle. And I've noticed that for accuracy, and this comes up for me as an ENTP, and I have accuracy as my co-pilot, I've noticed that the most motivating thing that I can experience is clarity. When something just mentally lines up for me, when it makes total sense. And the more a person is using the process of accuracy, the bigger the framework gets of all of the information they need to figure out. Meaning, a lot of times an INTP will feel like they have no reason to do anything ever because they haven't figured out all the problems of the world. Like, there's a huge it feels like there should be an answer to everything, and until they get the answer to everything, they don't feel particularly motivated. So they're just going to kind of sit around and do whatever it is that they want to be doing in the moment, whether that's smoking weed and playing video games, or whether that's reading like calculus books, or working with model sets, or whatever. I mean, like, whatever is the thing that is currently occupying their attention and making them feel good, they'll just want to do that forever because there's missing pieces of information, or there's just too much information to organize in order to figure everything out. So they have no clarity. So they don't do it, so they don't really particularly feel motivated to do anything. So the more an INTP can collect experiences that create clarity, the more they will feel inspired, meaning that life is not theoretical. The more you get outside yourself and experience things, you'll see where the theoretical and the real butt heads. All right. There's definitely a contradiction between what should be and what is. And the more you can get into the co-pilot process of exploration, the more you're going to find puzzle pieces that you didn't even know existed. A puzzle piece that can't be read in a book. A puzzle piece that has to be experienced. And the more experiences you collect, the more clarity you will get. And sometimes that's just subjective clarity. Sometimes that's just, I've discovered the meaning that I want to apply to life. And so now all of a sudden I know what I want to be doing with myself. On the other hand is the INFP that is inspired by alignment. Alignment is a sense that everything, all the parts inside of you, all the different voices that recognize the huge, swath of possible emotions for every particular situation, the part of you that sees how you can be the most amazing, beautiful saint, and at the same time you can be the biggest, worst villain or demon. Like, all of these parts of you that you understand and are in touch with so much, when they're all aligned with a single purpose, when they're all is basically screaming, or most of them are screaming the same chorus. And you go, this just feels right to me, to the very marrow of my bones. Everything inside me goes, this is the right action to take. Then you're in alignment, and that's your inspiration. Now, similar to an INTP, though, it's hard to know how you'll feel about something until you've experienced it. So the more you can get into that co-pilot process of exploration, you're not just collecting data, you're also collecting experiences just like the INTP is. But instead of seeing the difference between the theoretical and the real in a data way for an INTP, you are actually learning how you feel about things by truly experiencing them, by going through life and having it be experiential and going, oh, I thought I would feel this way, but I actually feel this way. And you sort of sort out all those complex emotions that are going on inside you. So the growth phase for both the types is the co-pilot of exploration. However, the information or the feeling that is being called by these experiences is different for both types. The result, though, is inspiration, and it's the important thing to do for both types.
Another thing about both these types that is similar is they have a tendency to be the world's quote-unquote whistleblowers. So for an INFP, they're always thinking about in terms of ethics and in terms of what's the right thing to do, what's the right course of action, what feels right. And in a company that's acting in a smarmy way or something, the INFP is going to look around and probably be like, wow, this feels like we're just not doing the right thing here. And they might challenge the authority in that company or that school or that situation or that team that they're on. And that's really important to them, to be doing the right thing, to be acting in, again, this is assuming the person's developed and has a good ethic about them. And that's an assumption I'm making, obviously. But let's assume that the INFP that's showing up wants good for the world. They are showing up with ethics on their mind. How are we behaving? How are we showing up to the world? Are we doing the right thing for people? And I think on the alternative for INTPs, they're similar in this, that they want to, but it's not so much about how we're behaving, it's more about how we're thinking in terms of, is this what we want to believe about people, about how we're moving through the world? Is this the kind of thought we want to have? And both of them, I believe, are interested, both the INFP and the INTP. They're interested in calling bullshit, in a sense, but for different things. The INFP is interested in calling bullshit about behavior, about making sure we're doing the right ethical thing. And the INTP is about calling bullshit about how we're thinking about this or how we're believing about this issue that will lead to behavior, obviously. And they're wanting to call bullshit on that. And I think both of them have a sense about whistleblowing, calling people out on their shit, and wanting to, that idea of being right. Well, they also want to do right for the world, right? I think that's the great thing about the IP nature, is they want to do the right thing in a sense as well.
Right. So the INFP is this who we want to be, and the INTP is this what we want to think, right?
Absolutely.
Is this what we want to be believing? And I think that's a really good distinction. And I think just to kind of wrap up this PHQ, because it's getting kind of long, I think the final thought I would have on the differences between the two types shows up in their 3-year-old process, or what's technically called their inferior process, which of course is different. For an INFP, that 3-year-old process in the CAR model is technically called extroverted thinking. We call it effectiveness. For an INTP, that 3-year-old process is technically called extroverted feeling, and we call it harmony. So the blind spot for an INFP is different than the blind spot of an INTP. The blind spot for an INFP is generally when it comes to systems that are the kind of systems that require little to no thought, because that's the point of setting up a system, it's by definition depersonalized. It runs even if you don't have necessarily people, individual people's subjective experience taken into account. That's the point of it, is that it's a system running and we don't have to insert ourselves into the system anymore, which is a blind spot for an INFP because they always want to personalize it. It's always about the subjective human experience. So INFPs have a tendency to unconsciously break systems, especially the systems that don't allow personal expression. However, because it's the 3-year-old process, and because they're unconsciously breaking systems that don't allow the personal experience, they've had to figure out workarounds that are unique to their type. And that's why we call that 3-year-old or inferior position the aspiration. It is a challenge that is unique to your type that you've had to solve in a way that other people would have just used that process to solve it. And for an INFP, I think this is generally shows up in creating new ways of seeing infrastructure. It's generally asking that question, is this the kind of people we want to be? It's developing art and developing a system of communication between each of us, where you don't have to directly communicate necessarily. If you've got a great piece of art, that is a system of communication that doesn't require one-to-one expression. You can look at a painting that was painted 300 years ago and still get the point, right? Or at least get your point from it, which was why the artist painted it in the first place. So it's an aspiration in the sense that they want to be able to create systems of communication, emotional communication. I think they're really good at. And I think the other way that they become aspirational with that 3-year-old process is in leadership. A lot of times we see effectiveness showing up as a leadership quality. And INFPs don't lead the same way that other people lead. They don't lead just by, top-down orchestration or by telling people what to do or generating a system of, this hierarchy. They generally do through inspiration and by being a personal example to other people. And that's how they lead. They lead through inspiration. So that's the INFP way of interacting with their aspiration. Before I move on to INTP, did you have something you wanted to say about INFP?
I was just going to say, as an example, of this, the person that I think that comes to mind in the business world, for example, is Richard Branson, who, in my opinion, I believe is an INFP. And in the 1980s, he took all the Virgin companies that he was running into the public sector. He actually made them public companies. And their board of directors and people that he had to interface with systems, and it removed his ability to be inspirational and to make decisions based on what was authentic to him. He had to start making decisions based on what other people thought and check in with committees. So he actually bought back all of his companies from the public sector and made them private companies again because it was failing. He wasn't able to lead effectively through this way. It was an aspiration for him, but he couldn't necessarily make that transition into an infrastructural system level, and he needed it to be more personalized to how he felt in the moment about how to run his companies. So this is an example of how an INFP can really embody that personal touch and lead companies to greatness. I mean, he's worth billions of dollars, and all his companies are, because he didn't have to think in terms of those external systems. And so that's just an example from the business world that can illustrate this for INFP.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. INTPs, on the other hand, their aspiration and subsequent blind spot is their 3-year-old process of extroverted feeling or harmony. And this generally comes up in their reluctance and sometimes inability to connect with other human beings, which is a reason why they tend to write other people off as stupid. It's difficult for them to connect and really develop that deep intimacy with just anybody. They're not as proficient at immediately generating intimacy in relationships and connections. And so what ends up happening, because this is a blind spot, they end up looking for alternative ways to really, connect with other people. And what you'll see is they'll connect through shared interests. They'll connect through things like, I talk about INTPs as being gamers a lot. For all of you INTPs that are not into gaming, that's perfectly acceptable and does not mean that you're a bad INTP. It's just that there tends to be a huge number of INTPs into gaming, especially under the age of 50. So what you'll see a lot of connections happening through massive multiplayer online games, MMOs. You'll see a lot of connections happening through things like a shared interest in a very unique and a subculture, like in-jokes, right? INTPs, and as an ENTP, I completely understand this. INTPs have a tendency to love referential humor. Referential humor means that you and I we at one point experienced something together. We either saw a comedy film together, or we saw a TV show together, or something. We experienced something together, and now we refer that as an in-joke to each other, and that helps us connect through humor. INTPs generally looking for alternative ways to connect with other people that don't have that same emotional, touchy-feely piece to it. And so their aspiration often shows up in connectivity, but connectivity on more of a shared experience way, as opposed to a touchy-feely, the kind of connectivity and intimacy that we generally see.
I think the reason why gaming is a great example of this is because as an INTP, you're leading with that accuracy process, which leads you to want to be competent at what you do. And so in a gaming platform, like a multiplayer game online, you can demonstrate your competency to each other. And it's a social experience of demonstrating competency back and forth. Oh, I see you're racking up these many points. you're competent at this game, and I recognize your competency, and now we have a shared social experience around your competency and my competency in achieving a goal together.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, to use an experience of somebody who runs a business, like Richard Branson as the INFP experience or example, my example is always Tony Hsieh of Zappos. Tony Hsieh, who we actually had the ability to profile him directly, so I actually know for a fact Tony Hsieh's an INTP.
Swim in his pool.
Yeah. I've hung out with Hsieh a couple times. He's a pretty cool guy. And I wouldn't say we're best friends, BFFs. We haven't braided bracelets for each other, but he's a pretty cool dude. And I've hung out with him some, and he's very, very much an INTP. And one of the things that's interesting about Tony Hsieh is that he went to his aspiration, his 3-year-old aspiration of harmony, by creating a company culture that helped people experience happiness. Happiness is a big part of his mission, generating corporate culture, systematizing happiness, systematizing culture and emotional interplay, and just this general sense of like intimacy within the company. And so it very much is his aspiration, because it's not a direct one-to-one relationship with happiness or with emotional intimacy. It's more of a systemic form of happiness, and it's been wildly successful. I think that the last time I heard the statistic, there was like 1,000 resumes turned in for every one position that they had opened up at Zappos. So Zappos has become like this darling in the business realm of like how to create company culture and how to do it. So I think those are really great examples of how people, an INFP and an INTP, you really utilize their aspiration, their blind spot / aspiration process of either effectiveness for an INFP or harmony for an INTP to achieve greatness, which both types can certainly do. But you can tell that they're doing it in a very different way.
So Carla, thanks for the question. What do you think if you've been listening? You have comments, questions you can come over to personalityhacker.com. And if you want to ask your own question, it's personalityhacker.com/questions. There's a way to record a question that we can actually play on the air and respond to, or you can type a question in and we can read it on the air and respond to it that way. Also join our growing community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. And we're really excited that you're a part of this community. Again, Carla, thanks for the question. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We will talk with you on the next PHQ Questions from the Personality Hacker community.